I've been thinking about what actually happens when a story ends badly. Not just, I didn't like it, but that specific feeling where you close the book and something in you goes flat. Like all the hours you spent inside the world just quietly deflated. And I don't think it's about the ending being sad or ambiguous, hard. I think it's about the ending feeling like it wasn't quite honest. I want to talk about what that looks like because I've written some of those endings myself, and for a long time, I didn't know I was doing it. This video is about the 5 ending patterns that tend to break a reader's trust, not through some big dramatic failure, through something quieter, something that doesn't quite honor what the story builds. I want to show you what I think is actually going wrong in each one, and what I've been trying to do differently. By the end of this video, you'll be able to recognize all 5 of these patterns in what you read, and more importantly, catch them in your own drafts before they cost you the ending your story actually deserves. Welcome, everyone. If you don't know me, my name is Daniel, and this is The Story Renaissance. The first one is the ending where every thread gets tied, every conflict settled, every question answered, and it all arrives just a little too neatly, like a room that's been cleaned so thoroughly it doesn't look like anyone lives there anymore. The epilogue of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows does this in a way that's always stayed with me. And I want to be careful here, because that series earned its ending. The battle, the sacrifice, the grief, all of that lands. But then there's the 19 years later chapter, and suddenly everyone is married and named their kids after dead mentors and standing on platform 9 3/4, and everything is just fine, completely, frictionlessly fine. I remember closing the book and feeling strangely empty. It wasn't what I expected after 7 books. The war happened, people died, friendships were fractured, and people were lost. And the ending acted like none of that weight was supposed to linger. Because people don't resolve like that. Not really. When a story does, when everything clicks into place and the last page just radiates this frictionless peace, something in the reader goes quiet in the wrong way. The endings that stay with me leave something open, not unfinished. There's a real difference between an ending that's incomplete and one that's just honest about the fact that life keeps going past the final page. But there's something still unsettled, still breathing. What I try to ask myself now is, what does this story need to leave behind? Not what does it need to answer, what does it need to leave the reader holding? Because sometimes what someone carries out of a book is more powerful than anything you actually gave them on the page. The tidy resolution is usually the kindest impulse going wrong. The next one is different. It comes from the most exciting impulse a writer has, and that's partly why it's so much harder to catch. Quick aside, if you're working on a draft and the ending keeps giving you trouble, I run a community for writers called The Story Renaissance. We work through this kind of thing together every week. The link's in the description below. All right, back to it. I have real sympathy for this one because it almost always comes from a good instinct. You want to surprise the reader. You want some energy in those last few pages. You want them to feel something they weren't expecting. And twists can absolutely do that when they work, when they reframe everything before them in a way that feels both earned and inevitable at the same time. When they don't work, the reader doesn't feel surprised, they feel cheated. The Lost finale is the example I keep coming back to. I know it's well worn at this point, but it's well worn for a reason. That show spent 6 seasons building a specific world with specific rules, and it asked its audience to pay very close attention to all of it. The mysteries weren't decoration, they were the whole contract. And then the finale essentially revealed that the mythology wasn't going to resolve into anything, that what really mattered was the relationships all along, which might have been a beautiful ending for a different show, but it wasn't the deal Lost made with its audience. 6 years of careful attention, and the ending said, actually, don't worry about all that. The response wasn't just disappointment. It was something closer to feeling foolish for having paid attention. And that's the thing about a twist that breaks the story's logic. It doesn't just fail to land, it retroactively damages what came before it. The reader starts wondering what they were even doing this whole time. What I check in my own drafts now is whether the ending I'm planning has any roots somewhere in the middle of the book. Not telegraphed, not obvious, but present. If I can't find it there, I'm probably importing it from somewhere outside the story. And that's almost always how you get a twist that breaks instead of lands. The next ending, though, is quieter than a bad twist, and in some ways, harder to defend against, because it feels like you're doing everything right. This might be the one I've written most often without realizing it. The story hits its climax, the character needs to change. That's what the whole thing has been building toward, and so they change. When I go back and read it, the change feels announced rather than felt. It happened because the plot required it, not because something in the character actually shifted. The Tie Runner is the example that comes to mind. And I want to say up front that it's a genuinely powerful novel, and Husseini is an extraordinary writer. But Amir's redemption arc is the spine of the whole book, which means it carries enormous weight. And for me, the ending arrives a little too cleanly. One act of physical courage at the end is asked to resolve decades of cowardice and self deception. The gesture is right, the emotion around it is real, but the interior work, the actual thing that would need to move inside a person for that kind of change to feel true, I don't quite feel it accumulate the way it needs to. The ending collects something the middle doesn't fully deposit. Readers feel this, even when they can't name it. What they get is this blankness, where the emotional payoff was supposed to be. You watch the character go through everything. They were there for all of it. But the change doesn't land in the chest, which is where it has to land. What I found is that unearned change almost always means the work wasn't done earlier. In the quiet scenes in the middle, in the small moments where the character should be slowly altered by what's happening to them. The ending can only collect what the story already put in the bank. So when the change isn't landing, I've learned to stop trying to fix the ending and start looking backwards instead. Find where the real turning point was supposed to happen, or did happen, but too faintly, and make sure it's actually on the page. The ending isn't where character change happens, it's where you finally get to see it. The fourth one is different from all of these, because the story doesn't fail dramatically, it just never quite arrives, and that's its own specific kind of disappointment. This one is subtle, and honestly, I still miss it in my own work sometimes. It's the ending where the story just stops. Plot's resolved, final scene is written, but the emotional note never quite arrives. It ends on information instead of feeling. The reader closes the book knowing what happened, they just don't feel anything about it. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is a good example of this, and specifically, the way the book keeps going after the central mystery resolves. The Harriet Wenger case gets solved, and it's genuinely satisfying, but then the novel continues into a long financial subplot involving Lisbeth and Blomkvist and Wernstrom, and by the time it ends, you've drifted so far from the emotional core of the story that the final pages feel like they belong to a different book. The plot concludes thoroughly, but the reader isn't standing anywhere emotionally when it does. You know what happened, you just can't quite feel it. What I've noticed in my own drafts is that this tends to happen when I end on an event rather than resonance. The character does the last thing, the situation resolves, scene ends, but the story never found the beat that lets the reader actually breathe, the moment that lets everything they've been carrying settle into something. The endings I love slow down right at the end, not artificially, but there's usually a moment of stillness. One small image, a line that lands heavier than it looks like it should. Just enough space for the emotional experience of the story to finish itself inside the reader. What I ask myself now is there a final image here? A last breath that's felt rather than explained? Not the narrator wrapping it up, something the reader gets to hold. Because the ending that stops is usually just one beat short of landing. Not a whole new scene, sometimes a paragraph, sometimes a single sentence. There's almost always something still missing that hasn't been written yet. The last one is the one I find hardest to talk writers out of, because it comes from the most sincere place. You worked hard on this. You want it to mean something, and that's exactly where it goes wrong. This last one is probably the most tempting to write, because it comes from genuinely wanting the story to have meant something. It's the ending where the theme gets stated out loud, usually by the protagonist, sometimes by that one wise secondary character who exists mostly to say wise things, sometimes by the narration itself. Here is what the story was about. Here is what you should take from it. Here's the lesson. American Beauty does this in a way I find hard to get past. And again, I want to be fair, because that film has real things to say about numbness, about beauty, about what it means to actually pay attention to your own life. And it says them well for most of its runtime. Then Lester Burnham dies, and the voiceover comes in, and it just explains it. He tells you what he feels, he tells you what he's learned, and he tells you that you'll understand it too someday. And I remember feeling the film quietly deflate in those last few minutes, not because the ideas were wrong, but because I'd already been feeling them for 2 hours. The movie didn't trust that. It reached back at the very end and made sure I got it. And that's the thing. It lands wrong even when the theme is genuinely true and genuinely felt by the writer. What I've come to believe is that theme stated is theme weakened. The moment a story tells me what it's about, I pull back slightly, even when I agree with it, because I was already feeling it. I was already carrying it, and the explanation doesn't deepen that feeling, it just replaces it with a summary. The stories that stay with me trust the reader completely at the end. They don't explain, they end on something true, an image, a choice, a moment of quiet. Let the reader do the last bit of work themselves. If the theme has genuinely been lived by the characters, if it's been in the scenes and not just gestured at, the reader already has it. The ending doesn't need to be delivered, it just needs to be the last honest thing. And that actually gets to the heart of what I think is going wrong across all five of these. Here's what I think is actually happening across all five of these. And it took me longer than it should have to see it. Every one of these endings breaks trust in its own specific way. It's too tidy, and you've managed the reader right out of their own experience. Bad twists, and you've ignored what they were paying attention to. Unearned change, and you skipped the work they needed to witness. Ending that stops, and you never gave them space to actually feel it. Sledgehammer ending, and you explained what they already were thinking. What all five have in common is they underestimate the reader. And usually it's not arrogance, it's fear. Fear that the ending won't satisfy, won't land, won't be clear enough. So the writer reaches in to make sure, and that reaching in is exactly what breaks it. The endings I keep coming back to, the ones I'm still thinking about years later, are the ones where I felt trusted, where the writer did the work, got it on the page, and then stepped back and let me have it. That's what I'm trying to learn. Finish the story and get out of the way. If you're somewhere in the middle of a draft right now and the ending feels like a wall, you know where it needs to go. You just can't find your way through. I built a space for that. It's called the Story Renaissance, a community of writers working through the hard parts of their project. The middle, the end, the moments where you're not sure it's working anymore and you don't want to figure it out alone. We do a weekly Write Together live stream where you can just show up and work. And we talk through this stuff. What's actually going wrong, what to try next, how to keep going when the draft has stopped making sense. No pressure, no gurus, just writers who get it. The link's in the description and the pinned comment below. I'd love to have you there. Here's what I want you to take from this. Every one of these endings comes from a real impulse, wanting the reader to feel okay, wanting to surprise them, wanting the character to grow, wanting the story to mean something. None of those are wrong instincts. They just go sideways when fear gets involved, when you stop trusting the reader and start trying to make sure. I've written versions of all five, and I'll probably write versions of them again. But there's a difference between falling into a pattern and not being able to see it. Now you can see it. The next video you need to watch is this one I made about the moments that make readers fall in love with your characters, because an ending can only pay off what your characters have already built. If the reader doesn't care about your characters, no ending is going to save it. The two videos go hand in hand. I'll see you there.